Picture this. A 16-year-old boy sits in the headmaster's office at one of England's most prestigious boarding schools. He's just announced he's dropping out. The headmaster looks at him and says something that would haunt, or perhaps fuel, this teenager for the rest of his life. Congratulations, Branson. You'll either end up in prison or become a millionaire. That teenager was Richard Branson, and here's the thing, he would actually come close to both. Today, Sir Richard Branson has built over 400 companies under the Virgin brand. He's worth roughly $3 billion. He's been knighted by the Queen. He's crossed oceans in hot air balloons, driven tanks through Times Square, and flown to the edge of space in his own rocket ship. But here's what makes his story truly remarkable. Richard Branson has never read a balance sheet. He couldn't tell you the difference between net and gross profit until he was 50 years old. He has no MBA, no college degree. He barely survived high school. And his secret weapon, the very thing his teachers thought would destroy him, dyslexia. Now, most documentaries about Branson focus on the glamour, the private island, the stunts, the celebrity friends. But if you really want to understand how he built one of the most recognizable brands on earth, you need to understand two things. First, how his supposed weakness became his greatest competitive advantage, and second, how he built a repeatable playbook for turning chaos into calculated success. This isn't just a biography. This is a masterclass in unconventional thinking. Let's start at the beginning. Richard Charles Nicholas Branson was born on July 18, 1950, in Blackheath, London. His father, Edward, was a barrister. His grandfather was a judge. The family expected Richard to follow suit, to become another distinguished member of the British legal establishment. There was just one problem. Richard couldn't read properly. In 1950, dyslexia hadn't really been invented yet, at least not as a recognized condition. Teachers simply thought Richard was lazy or stupid or both. He was beaten for poor performance. Pajama bottoms down, a cane across his backside. That was the British boarding school way. But something was happening inside young Richard's mind that nobody understood. While his brain struggled to decode letters on a page, it was developing other capabilities, extraordinary capabilities. He was learning to see the world differently, to simplify complexity, to connect with people in ways that others couldn't. His mother, Eve, played a crucial role here. She recognized that her son was different, but she refused to see that as a limitation. Eve was a former ballet dancer and flight attendant with an entrepreneurial spirit of her own. And she had unconventional methods for toughening up her shy, introverted son. One story Branson loves to tell. When he was about 4 years old, his mother stopped the car several miles from home, pushed him out, and told him to find his own way back. Her theory. Shyness, she told him, was just selfishness, being too focused on yourself to connect with others. Harsh? Maybe. But it worked. By the time Richard was 16, he'd developed extraordinary people skills. He could walk into a room full of strangers and make every single person feel like the most important person in the world. He just couldn't pass a test to save his life. So in 1966, Richard made a decision that would seem insane to most parents. He dropped out of Stowe School, one of England's most elite private institutions, to start a magazine, not a school newspaper, a real magazine, written by students, for students. about the things that actually mattered to young people in the 60s: Vietnam, music, politics, sex. He called it student. Now here's where we see the first glimpse of Branson's genius. He didn't have money. He didn't have experience. He didn't even have a proper office. He ran the magazine from a phone booth, telling advertisers he'd step out of the boardroom to take their calls. But what he did have was an uncanny ability to get people to say yes. He cold-called everyone. He managed to get interviews with Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist philosopher, James Baldwin, Vanessa Redgrave, Mick Jagger. How did a 17-year-old dropout score these interviews? Simple, he asked. And he asked with such genuine enthusiasm, such infectious energy, that people found themselves saying yes before they knew what they'd agreed to. The magazine never made money, but it taught Branson something infinitely more valuable than profits. It taught him that in business, enthusiasm and persistence could overcome almost any obstacle, and it would lead him to his real fortune. See, while running Student, Branson noticed something. His readers loved music. They spent whatever little money they had on records, but record shops in Britain were expensive, impersonal, corporate. What if there was a better way? In 1970, Branson started a mail-order record business, selling albums at discount prices through ads in Student magazine. He needed a name. One of his colleagues suggested Virgin, because they were all complete virgins at business. Branson loved it. When a postal strike hit Britain in 1971, Branson pivoted. He rented a tiny space above a shoe shop on Oxford Street in London and opened his first physical record store. It was unlike any record shop that existed. No fluorescent lights, no pushy salespeople. Instead, he scattered cushions on the floor, let customers smoke joints, and set up headphones so people could actually listen to albums before buying them. Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, Frank Zappa, the psychedelic sounds of a generation. On opening day, the line stretched half a mile down Oxford Street. But here's where the story takes a dangerous turn. Cash-strapped and desperate to keep his business afloat, Branson made a terrible decision. He figured out a scheme to avoid paying British purchase tax by claiming records were being exported when they were actually sold domestically. It was fraud, and he got caught. In 1971, Richard Branson was arrested, charged with tax evasion, and briefly jailed. He faced the very real possibility of prison time. His mother mortgaged the family home to pay his fines and legal fees, about £60,000, a fortune at the time. Branson has called this moment the most important lesson of his life, not because he got away with it, but because he almost lost everything. He made a promise to himself. Never again would he take shortcuts. Never again would he risk everything through dishonesty. From that moment on, Branson's risk-taking would be bold, but it would be honest. With the record shops generating cash, Branson had a wild idea. What if he could build a recording studio? Somewhere artists could escape the sterile corporate environments of London. Somewhere creative, magical. In 1972, he bought an old manor house in Oxfordshire, north of Oxford, and converted it into a residential recording studio called The Manor. The concept was revolutionary. Artists could live on site, work at their own pace, create in an atmosphere of total creative freedom. And then walked in Mike Oldfield. Oldfield was a shy 19-year-old multi-instrumentalist with a 49-minute composition that no major label would touch. It was too long, too weird, no vocals, no recognizable format. Branson listened to it and heard something extraordinary. He signed Oldfield to the new Virgin Records label and released Tubular Bells in 1973. The album became a phenomenon. It stayed on the UK charts for 247 weeks. It would eventually sell over 15 million copies worldwide, becoming one of the best-selling instrumental albums in history. Virgin Records was on the map. But here's where Branson's unconventional thinking really started to pay off. In 1977, every major label in Britain was running from a band called the Sex Pistols. They'd already been dropped twice for their outrageous behavior, spitting at audiences, cursing on television, causing riots. Everyone told Branson to stay away. Too risky, too controversial. Career suicide. Branson signed them immediately. And then he pulled off one of the greatest publicity stunts in music history. When the BBC banned the Pistols' single God Save the Queen during the Queen's Silver Jubilee, Branson rented a boat and sailed the band down the Thames River right past the Houses of Parliament. The Sex Pistols played their band song at full volume while Big Ben chimed in the background. Police boats arrived, arrests were made, and the next morning it was front-page news across the world. The song shot to #1 or #2, depending on who you believe. Some say the charts were rigged to prevent a song called God Save the Queen from topping the charts during the actual Queen's Jubilee. Either way, Branson had discovered something powerful. Publicity was free, advertising cost money, and if you could generate publicity, you could compete with companies 10 times your size. Now, let's pause here to understand what was really happening inside Branson's mind. Remember, this was a man who couldn't read a financial report, who got confused by spreadsheets, who literally had to have the difference between net and gross profit explained to him with crayons and a picture of fish in a fishing net. At 50 years old, during a board meeting, one of his directors pulled him aside and drew a picture. The sea was gross revenue. The fish caught in the net, that was net profit. Branson later joked that he'd been name-dropping net and gross ever since. So how do you build a $3 billion empire when you can't do the basic math? You delegate. Branson turned his weakness into a philosophy. He couldn't do the detailed work, so he became obsessed with finding people who could. I used my dyslexia to my advantage, he's explained. I learned to delegate those tasks I wasn't so good at. This freed me up to look at the bigger picture. He hired brilliant operators, financial wizards, people who loved spreadsheets the way he loved adventure, and then he gave them something extraordinary, freedom and ownership. This brings us to 1984 and the decision that would transform Branson from music mogul to global business icon. Picture this. Richard Branson is stranded in Puerto Rico. His flight to the British Virgin Islands has been canceled. There's a beautiful woman waiting for him there, Joan Templeman, who would later become his wife. Most people would complain, call the airline, wait for the next flight. Branson walked to the back of the airport terminal, found a charter company, and rented a plane for $2,000. Then he found a small blackboard, wrote Virgin Airlines at the top, and offered seats to his fellow stranded passengers for $39 each. He filled the plane. On that flight, one of the passengers turned to him and said, "Sharpen up your service a bit, and you could be in the airline business." The next day, Branson called Boeing. "I've just had a bad experience," he told them. "I'm thinking of starting an airline called Virgin." Do you have any second-hand 747s for sale? Everyone told him he was insane. Friends, business advisors, the press, industry experts. A tiny record company taking on British Airways, Pan Am, and TWA with their 800 planes combined, suicidal. And on paper, they were absolutely right. But Branson had a secret weapon, and it wasn't money. It was Sir Freddie Laker. Laker was a legendary British entrepreneur who had started his own low-cost airline in the 70s. British Airways had crushed him through predatory pricing. His airline went bankrupt. His reputation was destroyed. But Laker agreed to have lunch with Branson and gave him two pieces of advice that would shape everything. First, don't go all economy like I did. Create a three-class system. Give people premium options. Second, British Airways will try to wipe you off the map like they did to me. 3 words of wisdom: sue the bastards. Branson took both pieces of advice to heart. On June 22, 1984, Virgin Atlantic Flight VS-1 departed from London Gatwick to Newark, New Jersey. It wasn't just a flight, it was an 8-hour party in the sky. Celebrities, media, Virgin employees, 70 cases of champagne, and the infectious energy of a company that had absolutely no business being in the airline industry. But here's what made Virgin Atlantic different, and this is crucial to understanding the Branson playbook. He didn't try to compete on price alone. He didn't try to be the cheapest. Instead, he asked a simple question: what do people actually hate about flying? And then he fixed it. Cramped seats? He made them bigger. Bad food? He hired actual chefs. Boredom? He became the first airline to put individual entertainment screens in every seat, years before it became standard. Virgin Atlantic was the first airline with 3 classes, including a premium economy section that gave regular people a taste of luxury. And every single innovation was wrapped in the Virgin brand identity: fun, irreverent, customer-obsessed. The airline was profitable in its first year. By 1990, Virgin Atlantic had grown enough to move from Gatwick to Heathrow, putting it in direct competition with British Airways at the world's busiest international airport. And that's when the gloves came off. British Airways was the flag carrier of the United Kingdom, massive, established, politically connected. And they saw Virgin as an existential threat. Lord King, BA's chairman, allegedly told his CEO, "Do something about Branson." What followed would become known as the Dirty Tricks campaign, one of the most notorious cases of corporate sabotage in business history. BA staff hacked into Virgin's computer systems. They called Virgin passengers, pretending to be from Virgin, telling them their flights had been canceled, and offering to rebook them on BA. They accessed confidential booking records. They spread false stories to the press about Virgin's financial troubles. They even hired private investigators to dig through the garbage of Virgin employees. In January 1991, Virgin filed a formal complaint with the European Commission. BA's response? Operation Barbara, a dossier designed to discredit Branson, leaked to friendly journalists. False stories started appearing. Virgin was broke. Virgin couldn't pay its fuel bills. Virgin was going under. Branson had a choice. He could let the giant crush him like they'd crushed Freddie Laker. Or he could fight. He chose to fight. In March 1992, Virgin sued British Airways for libel. To fund the lawsuit, Branson made the most painful decision of his life. He sold Virgin Records, his first love, his creation, his musical baby, to EMI for £500 million. He reportedly wept when the deal closed. "I had to protect the child that was being bullied," he explained later. Virgin Atlantic was a child at school who was being bullied, and I needed to defend it. In January 1993, just before the case was set to go to trial in what the British press had dubbed the mother of all libel battles, British Airways surrendered. The evidence against them was overwhelming. BA issued a public apology. They paid £500,000 in damages to Branson personally, plus $110,000 to Virgin Atlantic, plus £3 million in legal fees. At the time, it was the largest libel settlement in British legal history. But what Branson did with that money tells you everything about his leadership philosophy. He distributed every penny, the entire £610,000, among his Virgin Atlantic staff. He called it the "Be a bonus." "They tried to kill us," Branson said. "We're still here." Bookings at Virgin Atlantic surged 30% overnight. The public saw Virgin as David defeating Goliath. Brand experts estimated the scandal created over £100 million in long-term brand value. Now let's step back and understand what Branson had actually built. Because it wasn't just an airline or a record company, it was a system, a repeatable playbook for manufactured luck. Most people think Branson is a wild risk-taker who got lucky. But when you examine his decisions closely, you see something much more calculated. Here's the Branson playbook. Step 1. Find an industry where customers are being treated badly. Airlines, banks, mobile phones, rail travel. If people are frustrated and underserved, there's an opportunity. Step 2. Enter with the Virgin brand, which already carries trust, irreverence, and an expectation of better service. The brand becomes your entry ticket. Step 3. Structure deals to protect your downside. When Branson started Virgin Atlantic, he negotiated a deal with Boeing that allowed him to return the plane after 1 year if the business failed. He could walk away with minimal losses. Step 4. Use PR instead of advertising. Create stunts. Make headlines. Get free media coverage worth millions. Step 5. Put culture and employees first. Happy employees create happy customers. Happy customers create loyal fans. Loyal fans become free marketers. Step 6. Hire operators who are smarter than you and give them real ownership and freedom. The PR element deserves special attention because Branson elevated it to an art form. When Virgin launched a bridal wear store in 1996, Branson shaved his beard and wore a $10,000 wedding dress on a catwalk. When Virgin Cola launched in the United States, he drove a tank through Times Square and pretended to fire at the Coca-Cola sign, which had been wired with explosives the night before, to look like it actually blew up. He crossed the Atlantic Ocean in a hot air balloon twice. He kite-surfed across the English Channel. He appeared in James Bond films. He ran in episodes of Baywatch. Every stunt served a purpose. Every headline reinforced the Virgin brand. And here's the genius part. Branson has admitted he was naturally shy, introverted. He had to force himself to become the public face of Virgin. Before we launched the airline, I was a shy and retiring individual who couldn't make speeches, he said. I had to train myself into becoming more of an extrovert. The persona was as engineered as the business model. But the publicity stunts were just the visible part of Branson's system. The deeper magic happened inside his companies. Let's talk about culture, because this is where Branson's dyslexia actually became his greatest competitive weapon. Because he couldn't process written reports effectively, Branson developed a different management style. He walked the floor, he talked to people, he asked simple questions and listened intently to the answers. He carries a notebook everywhere, always has since his student magazine days. He writes down everything people tell him because his dyslexic brain processes better when he captures information physically. And because he couldn't do the detailed work himself, he had to trust others completely. I have always believed in the art of delegation, Branson has explained, finding the best possible people for Virgin and giving them the freedom and encouragement to flourish. Notice that word, freedom. This isn't delegation as most managers practice it, handing off tasks while maintaining tight control. This is genuine autonomy, real ownership. Here's a perfect example. Virgin Atlantic's PR director, Will Whitehorn, was Branson's highest-paid employee. Not the CFO, not the head of operations, the PR person. I suspect in most companies the public relations person is down at number 20 in the pecking order, Branson has explained. But here, he is fighting incredibly important battles. Branson reportedly spends at least 25% of his time on public relations activities, and Whitehorn had a staff member whose only job was dreaming up the next headline-grabbing stunt. Because Branson understood something fundamental, in a world where advertising costs millions, earned media is free. And a great story travels further than any advertisement ever could. When Virgin Atlantic staff share stories about Branson, personally calling them to say thank you, which he does regularly, that creates more loyalty than any bonus could. By the late 90s, the Virgin brand had expanded far beyond music and airlines. Virgin Mobile, Virgin Trains, Virgin Money, Virgin Megastores, Virgin Radio, Virgin Cosmetics, Virgin Brides. Not all of them succeeded. Virgin Cola lost its war against Coca-Cola and Pepsi. Virgin Cars never took off. Virgin Clothing flopped. But that was part of the system, too. Branson structures each Virgin company as a separate entity. If one fails, it doesn't contaminate the others. The brand survives even when individual ventures don't. We try things in a small way, Branson explains. If it looks like we've misjudged, we quietly move on to something different. But if it looks like it's worth putting more fuel on the target, we keep it going. This is strategic experimentation, not reckless gambling. Test small, fail fast, scale what works. And then, in 2004, Branson announced his most audacious venture yet. Virgin Galactic, a company designed to take paying passengers to the edge of space. It was classic Branson. An industry dominated by governments and defense contractors. Massive technical challenges, billions of dollars at stake, impossible odds. Everyone said he was crazy, again. The road would be long and tragic. In 2014, a test flight crashed in the Mojave Desert, killing co-pilot Michael Alsbury. For any other entrepreneur, that might have been the end. But Branson pressed on. He attended the funeral. He met with the families. He committed to solving the technical problems and making space tourism a reality. On July 11, 2021, at the age of 70, Sir Richard Branson strapped himself into Virgin Galactic's VSS Unity and flew to the edge of space, 86 kilometers above Earth. Weightlessness, the curve of the planet below. He became the first billionaire founder of a space company to actually travel to space in his own ship, beating Jeff Bezos by 9 days. So, what can we actually learn from Richard Branson? Let's boil it down to the principles that made him who he is. First, your weakness can become your system. Branson couldn't read balance sheets, so he built a company that didn't require him to. He hired people who could do what he couldn't and gave them real power. His dyslexia forced him to simplify, to communicate clearly, to focus on the big picture. The Virgin brand became known for simplicity precisely because its founder needed everything explained in simple terms. Second, protect the downside, and the upside takes care of itself. Every major Branson bet included an exit ramp. The Boeing deal that let him return the plane. The separate company structures that limited losses, the constant testing before scaling. He took big swings, but he always knew how much he could afford to lose. Third, brand is a bridge. The Virgin brand became Branson's unfair advantage. It let him enter airlines, phones, banking, trains, industries where he had zero experience, because customers already trusted the name. Building that brand took decades of consistent behavior, putting customers first, creating emotional connections, being authentic and irreverent. Fourth, publicity beats advertising. Every PR stunt Branson ever pulled was essentially free marketing. While competitors spent millions on ads, Branson generated headlines that reached more people and created deeper emotional impact. But he understood something crucial. Stunts only work if the underlying product is good. You can get people's attention, but you can only keep it if you deliver real value. Fifth, culture is strategy. Happy employees create happy customers. Branson invested in his people before almost anything else, and they rewarded him with loyalty, innovation, and extraordinary effort. The Be a Bonus wasn't charity. It was strategic culture building. It told every Virgin employee, we're in this together, and when we win, you win. Sixth, delegate with trust, not control. True delegation means giving people both responsibility and authority. Branson didn't just hand off tasks. He handed off entire businesses to operators he trusted, then stepped back. If you are not always there, he said, it forces other people to call the shots, which in turn improves their own leadership skills, builds their confidence, and strengthens your business. And finally, seventh, keep saying yes to life. At 75 years old, Branson is still launching companies, still pulling stunts, still searching for the next adventure. When his wife Joan passed away in late 2025 at age 80, after nearly 50 years of marriage, Branson shared his grief publicly, the same transparency he's brought to everything. He's faced failures, near bankruptcy, criminal charges in his youth, the death of colleagues in pursuit of his dreams. But through it all, his philosophy has remained constant. Screw it, let's do it. So here's the question I want to leave you with. Richard Branson built one of the most recognizable brands on earth, created billions in wealth, employed tens of thousands of people, and fundamentally changed multiple industries. And he did it all while being functionally unable to read a financial statement. His headmaster was right in a way. Branson did almost end up in prison. Those early tax troubles could have derailed everything. But he chose a different path. What Branson understood perhaps better than any entrepreneur of his generation is that business success isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about seeing clearly what customers actually need. It's about building systems that don't depend on your weaknesses. It's about surrounding yourself with brilliant people and giving them genuine freedom. And it's about having the courage to take bold action while protecting yourself if you're wrong. The dyslexic dropout who couldn't pass a test became one of Britain's most successful entrepreneurs. The shy introvert who clung to his mother's skirt became a global celebrity. The teenager who almost went to prison became Sir Richard Branson, Knight of the Realm. Maybe your supposed weakness isn't a weakness at all. Maybe it's the foundation of an entirely different kind of success. That's the real art of making billions. If this story inspired you, hit that subscribe button. We've got more tales of unconventional billionaires coming your way, people who broke every rule and built empires nobody thought possible. Until next time.